So we're glad you could join us. And we have some questions. You know, you both taught a number of years in both separate school and inclusive school. Are there any other points you'd like to make about the difference in those settings and why you believe now and are sitting here telling us about it, that students should have opportunities in general education settings?
I think something that Jean and I have both talked about is we no longer believe that we know what kids are going to be successful where, or when they're going to be successful, or we can't predict what learning is going to be important. I had a student in a fifth grade classroom, and I was talking with one of our friends from who we taught with at the segregated school, and I said, this kid learned all the states and all the capitals. I was like amazed that he did that. And she said, yeah, but how functional is that? And I thought, oh man, I don't know how functional that is. I don't know all the states and all the capitals. Is that really important? So of course that night I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I'm doing the wrong thing. It's not, they're learning stuff, but it's not really important. It's not going to make a difference for them. And I swear somehow this student kind of must have somehow tuned into me, because the very next day I was supervising playground, and we positioned people at each side of the playground because this student also had a tendency to leave the playground when he wasn't supposed to. And what he liked to do was walk the perimeter of the playground at recess and do some self-regulatory behavior. He rarely interacted with other kids. And that day I was thinking, oh man, I'm doing the wrong thing. And I'm watching him and not feeling any better about myself as a teacher. And some of his classmates were sitting down in like the sandy area, and he walked past them, and at that point they had learned the states and capitals through a song, and they were singing the song. And he walked right past them, they're singing the song, he walks right past them, and all of a sudden he stops. And he turns around, and he's still doing all the self-regulatory behavior, but he turns around and he goes and he sits right down with those kids and starts singing the States and Capitals song with them. And I thought, yeah, it is functional. One of the things he's supposed to work on is communication and getting and being with other people and socialization skills, and that was the perfect thing. And I was teaching him communication. We were doing an ABA program where he had to touch his eye, touch his nose, touch his ear, but nobody in his class is talking about touching your eye, your nose, or your ear. They're talking about the states and capitals. So he didn't have anything to talk about. And so that types of shared culture, general curriculum, becomes really important.
Did you see or realize, did the kids see or realize friendships and in addition to improved social relationships and communication?
Yeah, it reminds me, after I left the middle school, I was there for 4 years, and because of caseload numbers and so forth, I went to elementary school to full inclusion setting. And I remember sitting with a second grade student that I was on my caseload, and her little friend. And the student I had was nonverbal, again, before we had those communication systems in place. And I'm trying to answer for her inappropriately, or, kind of have the conversation going. And I happened to notice that this little girl started going back like this and talking to the student with disability. I realized she doesn't want me in this conversation. So I backed out, let them. She was perfectly fine. Their first open house, one of the moms at the second grade, she came to me and she said, my daughter kept coming home and talking about her friend, and she goes, it wasn't until I got here that I realized she had a disability. So, that those young kids just, they don't think about the limitations like we as adults tend to.
The other thing that I think is important to think about is that classmates without disabilities aren't little teachers. they're classmates without disabilities. They're just classmates. So when we set up some of those supports that are more formal, maybe it sets up that tutor 2D kind of relationship. And I think all kids need both of those roles. So we have to think of ways that the student with special needs can also be the tutor sometimes. And that might be how you set up a communication system, what's on that communication system. So just, it's making sure that kids are more equal. Another point that I think I would recommend that people do is have joint planning time between the special education teacher and the general education teacher. What I found was sometimes without that planning time, I would go in a classroom and I didn't know what kids were doing. I didn't know what they were supposed to be doing. And so I wasn't prepared, or my teaching assistant wasn't prepared with those adaptations and accommodations that the student needed. But I found if I spent time planning with that general ed teacher, I knew what was going to happen, I knew what had to be adapted, and I could also make whatever adaptations were necessary. I could usually make those appropriate for all students in the classroom. So it wasn't just the kid with special needs, but it was other kids as well. Like in a kindergarten room that I was in, the student was working on a communication system where there were black and white icons that went with the printed word. And the kindergarten teacher and I decided everything that all kids read should have those icons, and it helped everybody learn to read. And making those adaptations only as special as they need to be. Because sometimes we make adaptations that students can't or don't want to use because they're different from everybody else's. And the class was doing a lesson on initial blends, and they had tongue depressors with the blends written on, and I forget how they were doing this, but they had to move those tongue depressors.
You would match a blend with the ending sounds.
Probably. And when that started, the special ed teacher had the student included, but she took the student with the IEP from her desk and went back to a table in the back of the room. And she had, instead of tongue depressors, she had big strips of cardboard with the blend on it. And the student really was not behaving really well. She didn't want to leave her desk. And so we talked with the special ed teacher about that later, and we said, so what do you think the issue was? And she said, well, she really didn't want to leave her desk. And one of us said, well, so why did you have her do that? And she said, well, the materials were too big to use on her desk. And so we questioned a little bit more, and we said, well, did she need those big materials? And she said, no, I just thought it would be easier for her. And so had she used the regular ed materials in the space that other kids were in, all of that behavior she wouldn't have had. And because the kid was not wanting to be there, she wasn't learning anything anyway. At her desk would have been the best place for her. So not making things special if we don't have to.
Which reminds me of a couple other pieces of advice I would give, because we said definitely go full inclusion. It's easier to man, if you're trying to man a self-contained room and get out and support kids. It's not enough just to send a teaching assistant out. You need to be out there, you need to be planning with the teacher. But one of the advantages of doing the full inclusion too is I don't have to develop this lesson plan. I use their lesson plan, co-plan with them, and then I just look at these supports that I need to build, which I often heard, wow, this helped so-and-so too. So-and-so who's not on the IEP really benefited. For when I was teaching 5th grade, I took the class novels that they were reading and I summarized each chapter into like 3 paragraphs. They listened to the kids read it but they then use this to support them, to help with the content and comprehension. And I ran into that teacher a few years later. She goes, I still use those with her class. But the other thing is just sticking the child in the classroom is not inclusion. They have to be participating. They have to have this the same goals of learning the same content, possibly at a different level, but it's the same. And so having them being separate in the same classroom doesn't work. If they need something special and maybe they need more space, bring some peers over and work there together. But I think those are two things I would really concentrate on is not tying yourself up, making your own lesson plans, work with the teacher, and then the other is to be sure that that student's participating with the same goal in mind.
Excellent. And in our day of standards, which really wasn't back then as much as it is today, that's really incredibly important. Do you think you saw kids make gains that you never, well, you've mentioned that several times, so would one of the reflections be we saw kids make gains we never expected them to achieve?
I saw them being able to answer some of the same questions that other kids did. I saw a kind of general understanding of things. Like even if I don't know why this sticks out. I remember a student I had that her spelling words were different, but in class she would ask, like, raise her hand, how do you spell enthusiastic? And I'm like, I know that's not one of her spelling words. So maybe she didn't learn to spell it, but guess what? She's learned to use that word. So there were lots of ways that maybe didn't always translate exactly out on paper, but you could see it. Just little things all the time I saw kids. And what was interesting, I think we've talked about this, is we felt so challenged all the time to keep up with what we were seeing our kids. Like, oh wow, if they learned that, then I better not be settling with only trying to teach this. So I'm always trying to figure out how can the class is going to do presentations on the animals that they've studied in science. How can this student who's nonverbal give her presentation? Not only how does she give her presentation, but how does she have choices in accessing this information and putting it together? So we kept pushing it further and further. It's not good enough for her just to hit a switch that we've recorded. We need her to actually be able to access some information, choose which of that information she wants to put in the recording, and then do it. So that was a process for us.
Exactly, so it makes learners out of all of us, right? Yeah.
I've had a couple of different principals that have said something that have really made me reflect on my own beliefs. Because they're students, they have the right to be in this school regardless of whether they're identified as special ed. That identification only provides them additional support. It doesn't make them a different person. And so that one resonated with me. And then a principal that we had in the elementary school, we're like, well, this teacher's really good. Can we put them in their classroom and say, well, they teach here, they're teaching the kids that are here. They don't pick and choose who they teach. And again, it reminded me, these are kids, they're not special ed people, they're kids who receive special ed services. And I try to keep that in my mind as I'm thinking